I guess the project was in two parts. The first one here in the gallery space. And at that stage it wasn't really known what the second part would be. It was left open. But the first part it sort of came out of a residency I'd done in Iceland. And I had chosen a very sort of remote part of the country to do that in. And it was surrounded by mountains, and I was staying in a very small community in the far eastern side of the country. And I had lots of conversations there with people who lived there and about their experience of being, well, how I perceived them anyway. I perceived them to be isolated from the rest of the country and the rest of Europe and the world. So lots of conversations there, and then those conversations were transcribed, and some of those transcriptions were used as in the words that the performers used in the space. There was also I did a lot of research on the residency about an Icelandic mythology, about hidden people, about people who were always in the background but never seen and would reveal themselves. And there's also a very strong sense of darkness there. I was there in the middle of winter, so I was really interested in how people might relate to each other in those long dark months, and whether that brought people together or not. So there were some sort of key themes that came up in that residency, or were developed through the residency, to do with being close and distant, and being together and apart. Those kind of dichotomies that I'm interested in the practice in general. So for the performance in the space, I worked with 5 performers, and they used instrumentation and spoken word and song. And it was developed through rehearsals it lasted about half an hour. And I also worked with a magic lanternist, who had a portable lantern and who kind of roved the space, and we selected images that seemed to echo some of those themes I was talking about earlier. So it felt like as if there was a gathering of some kind. There were performers, but there were also audience members, and the performers were sitting embedded amongst the audience members. So initially nobody knew who was who, and they were sitting in concentric circles, which is a formation I'm really interested in, which sort of echoes, for example, the shaker dancing, and also Quakers. Quakers sit in concentric circles, so there's never a sense of hierarchy, but there's a sense of a common purpose, of everybody being gathered for something. So there's an expectation of something that could take place within the group. So ideally I wanted the audience to have a sense of that, a sense of something emerging out of nothing, out of the darkness. So the space itself was blacked out, and the only light source was the lantern projections. And ideally there's a pattern that I sort of or structure that I try and develop in these performances, where it feels as if at the beginning there's nothing, and then gradually things start emerging, whether that's an image or a sound, and then things might gradually build up to a crescendo of some sort. And I guess if I'm thinking about that crescendo, I'm thinking about a moment of synchronicity, a moment of togetherness, where certain themes emerge, and maybe there's a sense of the group feeling together, of a community being formed, and then just as quickly that sense of togetherness can disappear, and it sort of fades back to nothing at the end. So yeah, that sense of something coming out of nothing and emerging back to nothing. The Offsite thing, it took about 2.5 years, I think, to develop for various reasons. And the earlier version of it was a bit different. In fact, it was going to originally be on a floating platform that moved down the River Don and docked at various islands, and it was going to be based on a a diorama, which was an 19th century invention of a sort of a viewing space where you could see a changing scene through an aperture. And then it was decided that instead of using performers, I thought it'd be much more interesting to use participants, to invite people to make it more of an experiment, more of a way of finding out whether, in a very genuine sense, this community could be formed, and what would happen if we did bring these people together in this particular space. So there are definite ways in which the two parts of the project mirror each other. It was situated on an island on the River Don, so it was, it's not in the city centre, but it's very much within the city and within a sort of post-industrial part of the city. So it's, in some ways, it feels like an area that has been abandoned, but it's starting to be regenerated. So participants were invited to come to the island and to help construct a dome, a geodesic dome. So I've been working with an architect, Studio Polpo, for quite a while to develop this structure. And the geodesic dome is something I'm interested in because I guess it's associated with kind of utopian communities from the 1960s, like Drop City. And when Buckminster Fuller championed it, he was also thinking about a sustainable, reusable, relatively cheap, relatively easy to construct form of shelter. And in particular, he was interested in the relationship between the surface area of the structure and the relationship between that, or the ratio between that, and how much space it actually provides. So relatively, it's actually a really economical sort of structure. So the idea that this could be a kit, albeit a relatively complicated one, that could be reproduced in different locations is something I was interested in as well. So we all met on the island, and we had a lot of help from the River Stewardship Company to clear the site, and then we spent most of the day on Saturday trying to put this structure up. And it was, not surprisingly, extremely complicated to do, despite all the planning. And the dome went up, and it was kind of going up and up, and it looked like it was going to be completed in sort of a couple of hours. Then suddenly the architect hit a few technical problems, and it was largely because it was constructed on ground that wasn't level. So then we kind of reached this stage where, oh God, is this not working? What's going to happen next? And then other people in the group, and the group had expanded sort of quite organically to include, for example, some children and the architect's wife and some volunteers, and people just started to improvise and to take over in a really positive way, and they started to introduce organic materials, so leaves and branches and things from the island to complete the dome. My initial thought was, this could look awful, what's going on? But there was something actually quite refreshing about letting go of some elements of control of it, and then a realization, this is what the work is about. This is about a community forming and making its own decisions and having autonomy. And I found that really interesting to see how that developed. I like that part of Sheffield, that slightly run down post-industrial side of the city, where it feels as if, it's a part of the city that maybe has been neglected, and strange things can grow there, which they wouldn't be able to take place in other parts of the city so easily. So it's a sort of a site of experiment, maybe. I really wanted a diverse range of people, and maybe it wasn't, it's very hard to get a genuinely diverse range of people because of the nature of the event, I think. But I guess the biggest mix really was that there was a group of local residents, and then there were a group of artists. And those are the two main groups. And then there were other people who were involved in the projects who were architects or volunteers. And so I think that was good. That was good. That, you know, the thing I really didn't want to have was it just to be an art audience there, or participants who were within the art world, and maybe some of whom had experienced similar projects before, or, you know, they were familiar with a particular language, a particular discourse, and I wanted that sort of freshness of somebody just experiencing it for what it was, rather than it being an artwork in a particular context.